I want to thank Daniel for that kind introduction, and I want to personally thank Rotary again for supporting me in this great adventure I've taken and this learning opportunity it's been to me. So my topic today is climate change, forced migration, and state responsibility. I realize I need to define all three of these things because they might not be obvious. The very general topic is, are states responsible for when people have to get forcibly moved because of climate change effects? And we see the reason why I chose this topic is when we look at the literature, we find people tend to oversimplify. You have activists that are very well-meaning, they want to help these people, but they end up very oversimplifying the actual issues involved with forced migration. They will they'll try to have alarmist positions, like if we don't do something now, entire countries will be underwater, which is not necessarily how things happen. And so these alarmist stories don't necessarily help the people they mean to help. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have like industry groups or other, different political interests that try to say that there's no problem at all and that states don't really need to do anything. And so both of these positions tend to very much oversimplify the problem of all three of these areas. So this is the outline of my presentation. We're going to define each of these three areas of the topic. So what is state responsibility? How does climate change work? How does human displacement work? How do humans actually get moved around? And then we're going to look at the three categories of cases of displacement and talk about how responsibility works in those cases. That will be in the case of internally displaced people, what governments need to do for the people inside their own territory. The case of greenhouse gas emitting states. So this is states that are emitting they have factories that are emitting greenhouse gases in their territory. People in other countries are getting displaced, but do they have any responsibility to those people in other countries? And then we have the refugee-like cases. I put refugee in quotation marks, which we'll talk about because they don't actually meet the legal definition of refugees, but it's this kind of case where people are losing their land and they flee to another country in a refugee-like situation. What kind of responsibilities does the receiving country have towards these kinds of people? So starting with state responsibility itself. State responsibility is a set of principles and rules. We call them what are called secondary rules. So in international law, we have what are called primary rules. These are the normal rules like treaties and things that actually define what's a violation of international law. State responsibility comes after that. So the first thing we have to define is there's been some breach of international law that triggers state responsibility. So that's why we call them secondary rules. We find the violation first, and then that triggers the second level of rules. These rules were drafted. States accept them by custom, but they actually were drafted at the ICU, which I actually worked at in this building here. And this is the Palace of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. So state responsibility very generally defines, once you have a breach of international law, we ask these three questions. Does that breach actually connect to state conduct? Because a state really can't be responsible unless its conduct was the one responsible for that violation. What kind of remedies flow out? What does the state need to do once this violation has been defined? And then number three, who's an injured party that can use the rules of state responsibility to receive a remedy? So this is very abstract, so I tried to use this very concrete metaphor to try to give a picture of how it actually works. These are the typical issues of state responsibility. So we have this picture of the dominoes. What I want you to imagine is the hand is state conduct. This is things that the state are doing. Then we have a very complex series of all sorts, linkages of, physical phenomenon that happen. And at the end, this is our victim. And so when he gets hit, then that's some kind of violation or some kind of, this is our guy that gets displaced. So these are the questions we ask that connect the violation back to the state conduct. That's what state responsibility is about. So then we have duty. The question of duty is, does this state, are they actually responsible for taking care of this victim? For example, if this person is inside the territory, states have special responsibilities for the persons inside their territory that are different than persons outside their territory. Attribution. Once this violation occurs, can we actually connect it back to a hand? The problem is in these kind of complex cases, there are lots of fingers pushing lots of things. We need to actually connect it back to the state pushing the hand. So not to other hands, but to that hand for the state to be responsible. causation is actually the link of dominoes. Can we actually connect the violation through this linkages of so many different effects? So climate change is a very complicated physical phenomenon, and then human displacement is also very complicated. Can we actually connect all these dropping dominoes back to state conduct? And then intentionality. When the state made its conduct, did it know that people were going to be displaced? So in the context of climate change, we're talking about the state setting policies for greenhouse gas emissions. Did they know when they were allowing these emissions to happen that displacement would be one effect? So the type of responsibility a state will have varies depending on what kind of knowledge and foreseeability. Can they foresee this happening? Of course, states can still be responsible even if they didn't know. This is what we call strict liability in English, but the responsibility may vary by what the state knows. And then what kind of remedies are appropriate? If this domino falls, the basic idea of remedies, we need to restore the person injured to the state they were before the injury, but there are different ways to think about that. All right, so this is the first of our three topics, so climate change. The very brief thing of it is greenhouse gases in the atmosphere allow in short-wave radiation from the sun, but long-wave radiation going out gets reflected back so that it heats up. But what does it mean for state responsibility? One thing is companies are the ones actually emitting the greenhouse gases, not states. So we have to actually look at state, the regulations on factories, not the factories themselves. The greenhouse gases mix proportionally. It's not like greenhouse gases emitted by Japan is going to hurt someone directly in Greenland, for example, but 3% of that, if you go in Greenland and took a bottle of air, 3% of the greenhouse gases would have been sourced from Japan. So it mixes very broadly, but that's a problem sometimes for connecting responsibility. And states, can contribute greenhouse gases differentially. So 10% come from America, 3% come from Japan. So these are some of the complications of climate change for state responsibility. And also the actual effects. The Earth generally warms, but there's lots of different effects. There's sea level rise, melting permafrost, which is ice that people live on, water sources loss, desertification where land turns into deserts, more intense weather. Any one of these effects can have displaced people, but they displace people in different ways. And then science predicts likelihoods, not events. So this is like a loaded dice. So the science of climate change doesn't tell you if there's a huge typhoon. It doesn't tell you that was caused by climate change. What it tells you is, like, for example, it's not going to tell you the next roll of a dice will be a 4. What it will tell you is instead of 1 out of 6 times, maybe 3 times out of 6 times you'll get a 4. So this is the kind of how climate change science works. All right, now let's talk about the complexities of human displacement for responsibility. Human displacement is generally categorized by varying in 4 spectrums. It's very difficult to define it because, for example, voluntary force. Voluntary means people voluntarily decide for economic reasons they're migrating, versus like a storm is coming and they're forced off. But what we find in reality is people are along a spectrum of the environmental conditions are getting increasingly bad and economic opportunities are getting increasingly good. At some point they'll move. They're somewhere in between voluntary and forced. That's hard for responsibility because if it's voluntary, the person is responsible for themselves. The state shouldn't be responsible. They say we should be responsible for forced migration, but we find in reality it's somewhere in between. It also varies between temporary and permanent. People sometimes want to return as fast as they can, or it's permanent. A state would be more responsible for permanent migration. If the person can return, maybe a state wouldn't be responsible. But we find in reality people are in a spectrum between temporary and permanent. Between local and international, responsibility changes once a person crosses a border. But we find in reality it's people relocate into different areas. And then resilient and vulnerable. Sometimes the people relocating aren't actually the most vulnerable ones. Sometimes rich families are the ones that have the ability to migrate out first, and they're the ones that are more resilient. So we need to actually look at the facts on the ground about where they are along these 4 spectrums. Then the type of climate change can be related to displacement. There's rapid onset disasters like typhoons and floods. That tends to lead to forced migration. People don't have any choice, they need to leave. But you can tend to restore the area so they want to return. As opposed to slow onset changes like sea level rise turning into a desert or water sources loss, where people have a lot more time to decide how they want to migrate. But once an area is, for example, desertified or inundated by sea, people cannot return. So that's a different kind of issues of responsibility come up with that. And then there's even different types. For example, resource conflict. States may fight over water sources, and then people get displaced in the fighting. Or sometimes state even initiates and leads their own resettlement. And so they need to avoid abuses. They would be directly responsible for their own resettlement practices. So now we're going to look at the three situations of state responsibility. The first one is our internally displaced persons. So the main, there's the leading case of Budiyeva, which was a mudslide, but the main lesson we take from internally displaced people is the main responsibility is a duty to protect. States have a duty to protect persons being displaced inside their territory under human rights law. And then the main hook for that is actually the right to life. It doesn't necessarily always connect to displacement, but if people's lives are in danger, then the state has a special responsibility. The state also has certain procedural rights where they must investigate to find out if harm may occur, and they need to provide information to people. As for attribution, the state is... the state has a responsibility even for natural causes. The state is not causing the displacement, and the responsibility is not for the displacement itself. What they're responsible for is protective measures to take care of people in displacement. And then the question of foreseeability. According to the case law, states do not need to actually foresee the exact event that displaces. What they need to foresee, it's enough that they have information that an event of this type might occur. These mudslides might occur, people might need to move, we need to put protective places as a precaution. That's what states have the responsibility. And so what this means for states is they have a responsibility to understand climate science. Climate science is telling what kind of events they have. States have a responsibility to follow the science. Next, we have greenhouse gas emitting states. Leading cases are Trail Smelter and what's called Kivalina versus ExxonMobil. The Trail Smelter case just established the general principle in international law that states must pay for harm to other states. The Kivalina, this is the Kivalina village in Alaska. It's ice melted, so with climate change, and the sea has already started to inundate, come into the land. This was under American law. But what does it have to say under international? Oh, and so this village sued ExxonMobil. They're actually allowed to have standing in a court. The United States court allowed them to sue Exxon, but then they said it was a political issue that's better dealt under legislation. But what does international law have to say about it? The main issue with these kind of cases is when a state, and like the previous case, it's a legal violation when states do not protect people in their territory for internal displacement. But for this, there's no legal violation for a state allowing factories to emit greenhouse gases. It was not a violation of international law. So it's not proper responsibility. And states are very clear to say we don't want to be responsible if the activity was not illegal. But what they do have is the ILC drafted principles on what they call loss allocation. In this case, a new set of rules is established where states have a duty to provide some kind of equal access. So if the state is providing the greenhouse gas emitting state is providing protections to their domestic people, they need to provide those same protections to international people, to use those same protections. For example, standing in a domestic court to sue. So some of the issues of greenhouse gas emitting states, it's important that liability come back to factories. The reason is because of negative externalities. The economic costs of displacement are not part of the price of a good. This is called an externality in economics theory. The reason why you want to internalize that into a cost of business is because then states have an economic incentive to reduce costs. In reducing costs, they take steps to reduce the chances of displacement if it's a liability they might have. And also restorative justice. People have lost their homes. They need to be restored as a matter of restorative justice. There are different issues of causation. As I said, states should be responsible. You don't have to show that a particular greenhouse gas emitted from Japan actually physically harmed someone. What you need to show is they contributed to the general climate system. That's the basis of responsibility. Attribution, again, it's not the state isn't responsible for the emissions themselves, they're responsible for the regulations that control the emissions. And foreseeability is a very complicated question that we're going to move on for time's sake. All right, and then finally we have refugee-like cases. The leading case is Iona Te Teota. This is Mr. Te Teota. The New Zealand court denied him refugee status and returned him to Kiribati despite inundation. So this isn't his land, but his land is something like this. He's lost all his farmland, he's lost his livelihood. He tried to immigrate to New Zealand. This will tend to be the standard in international law. It's very difficult for people to get refugee status or for a country to accept it for climate change-related harms. So the main argument is that it applies to the population illegally. So if New Zealand allowed him to enter, then New Zealand is going to be in trouble because suddenly millions of claims will be open for people in his similar situation. The typical route, so as I mentioned before, refugee status applies generally under something called persecution, but, it's a legal complication. Let's just look at the issues. So for attribution and foreseeability, the way the law would generally work for the rights for whether they should protect these people is if it's very guaranteed that that person will suffer a human rights violation if they're returned. That's very difficult to make for environmental harms. But there's a special case if an entire state disappears. So states like Kiribati and Mauritius are worried about being completely lost. If they lose their territory, special obligations and responsibilities may open up for that special case. But again, the challenge is indiscriminate. Environment affects everyone indiscriminately, and the floodgate problem. If you allow one claim, it allows millions of claims. And then what's not talked about very often is the sovereignty challenge, which is state responsibility, even though it's a strong mechanism, sometimes it's not actually the best mechanism. One reason is because international law doesn't always need to get in the business. This is a very complicated issue that states need to, it takes very nuanced governance, and international law is a kind of big fat hammer hammering down. Sometimes to deal with these nuanced issues, it's not good to use a big hammer like this, and it treads on the sovereignty of states. And mass movements of population involves complex governance. It's not easily handled by individual claims, and a foreign state cannot easily govern another state's entire population via refugee-like status. States of origin like Kiribati should also be involved in negotiations. Some of the refugees gave testimony that they actually didn't want to be treated like refugees. They didn't want to be traded among greenhouse gas states where they can immigrate in as if they were bargaining chips or like credit chips. They wanted to have some dignity in their decisions about how they want to immigrate. So that concludes my presentation. Minasan arigatou gozaimashita. I apologize for speaking a little fast on such technical issues. It's the burden of being a lawyer.
Well, thank you for this breathtaking and passionate lawyer-ish presentation anyway. So what about some questions about this, let's say, always...
人権用語としたら大変に、どうぞ。平和研究のですね、大きな柱である人権用語にもつながるテーマをずっというふうに考えております。それで国家の責任ということが今大きく、言われましたけれども、国家が今そのクリストさんのおっしゃる考えを認める状況があるか、それで実際に国家が責任を感じたときに国家を裁くのは何か、例えば国際法のようなものがですね、新たに各国で批准されて、その上でそういうものができれば可能かもしれませんが、現状としてはどういうふうに考えられますか？
All right. Thank you for that question. That is a very good question. Responsibility depends on the forum in which it occurs. There's not an international court that will take cases that will hold states responsible. So depending on the type of forum, the type of responsibility will change. So when we mention like the refugee case, this is actually a domestic agency that's making the determination. So responsibility work one way for that. In the human rights case, there's not an international for regional bodies like the EU or the Americas, there actually is a court, and they will make determinations. So the Budayeva case I mentioned about the mudslide problem, that was actually brought in a case in EU. So that court actually made a determination. And the EU states gave up their sovereignty. They accept the judgments of the EU Court of Human Rights. So in that case, a court could make a determination. But in other cases where there's not a court like that, the states guard themselves so to speak. And then it would be the role of, for example, activists to say this is the international standard, and then they use the mechanisms of international politics to say, there's no court that's going to hold you to this, but we're telling you this is the international standard, and this is your obligation under international law, and different use methods of political activism.
Anyone else? Any more questions?
You're on a roll.
In one of your slides, a sentence said that the environment doesn't discriminate, or something like this. The environment is indiscriminatory. And it was under one of the reasons why states do or do not act or have responsibility. But I just wondered is that something that you think is true? Because when I think, okay, the environment doesn't pick and choose who it affects, but however, if you have certain resources, whether it's money or it's whatever, you can limit the effects of the environment on yourself. So
it's actually much deeper. So in the chapter on this, I go into exactly your question much deeper. Right, so the reason why I said it was relevant that the environment was indiscriminate was for the specific legal category of complementary protection, which is refugee-like protection. Generally, the harm that comes against a person has to be, it's difficult to explain because it's a nuanced legal concept, but under refugee law, you need to be persecuted. So there needs to be because of your category as a person, either your racial or ethnic identity is the reason why you're being, but it can't apply to every single person in your entire population, or some problem that applies very indiscriminately, because suddenly millions and millions of people would be open for refugee status in other countries, and other countries simply don't have the capacity to handle what should be the sovereign regulation of the home state. They need to take care of the poverty of these indiscriminate issues. So that's why I mentioned that. But what you mentioned actually targets a different thing, that actually the environment isn't discriminate, because we find in a lot of cases the people that are most vulnerable are, for example, the people that live along tracts of land that are known to flood a lot. Those land values will be very low, so poor economic people will tend to be in those areas. So actually climate change will affect these persons more discriminately. They will be under larger pressure. The problem is that international law doesn't always have a hook to make greenhouse gas emitting states or refugee states care about that. But as a matter of justice, restorative justice, the fact that, we'll put an even larger frame. The fact that there are a few rich states, only 6 states, the vast majority of greenhouse gases are only emitted by 6 states, and they're making a lot of money by this. The worst harms are being affected by the poorest states, and they're not getting any benefit from this. So you can see there is a justice issue involved. The problem is state responsibility is a very difficult way to handle this justice issue. That's why people tend to talk, we want to have some framework like in treaty law or some other negotiated framework to deal with these kind of justice issues.
May I?
Jikan desu ka?
Okay, so I think, Cade, you can answer them after.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
We'll have
That has
a
been
question and answer party
passionate
after the event.
and really deep.
Minasan arigatou gozaimashita.
Thank you.